This week on Quadriga, Syrian Repression. Can Assad get away with it? The crackdown continues even after a deal between the Syrian government and the Arab League that was supposed to have ended the violence. The plan stipulated that the government withdraw its troops from cities like Homs and Hama, where the clashes have been the most serious. The UN estimates that since the protests began in March, more than 3,000 people have been killed. President Assad has ignored international criticism and his warning against foreign military intervention. Your host this week is Terry Martin.
Hello and welcome. How far will the Syrian regime go to crush the uprising? Do the protesters have any chance of bringing about change on their own, or is international intervention within the realm of possibility? This week on Quadriga, we're talking about the problem of Syria.
Joining Terry Martin in the studio this week, Alexander Bühler is a freelance broadcast and print journalist who's covered numerous conflicts around the world. He's recently returned from Syria, where he was one of the few foreign correspondents reporting from inside the country. Heiko Wimmen is a program manager for the Middle East office of Germany's Heinrich Böll Foundation. He's done extensive research on the Middle East and also served as a reporter in Lebanon. Ahmed Badawi is a fellow at Germany's ZMO Research Center. He's worked for the International Crisis Group, served as a journalist in Egypt, and is now focusing his research on Islamist movements.
Now, on Wednesday, the Arab League apparently successfully negotiated an agreement with the Syrian government to pull Syrian troops out of major cities to free political prisoners. There's supposed to be political prisoners freed, which was, I think, surprised many people. And there were supposed to be talks held with the opposition. Heiko, I want to ask you first, Heiko, is there any hope now that Syria will honor this agreement? Sorry.
I don't really see anything of that happening. I mean, the past 48 hours have seen scores of dead. Last news I had was like 2,000 people arrested in the suburbs of Damascus. I mean, the signals that we see pretty much point into the other direction. And it sort of reminds me a bit of the days of the bad old days of the Lebanese civil war, when you had one Arab League mediated ceasefire after the other, who were honored only in the breach.
Well, let me ask you, Ahmed Badawi, do you think that Assad even cares whether the Arab League is going to give it the Syrian regime support?
Well, I think Assad should be aware that this is his last chance. The whole region is getting so hot, and whatever is happening in Syria now, Assad, maybe not many in his regime are aware of this, but he himself should be aware that this is his last chance to make things right. Without the support and the cover provided to him now by the Arab League, it is very likely that there will be more concerted effort by the international community to try to deal with the Syrian problem. Now that Libya is out of the way, there is all this talk about a potential military strike against Iran. There is escalation between Israel and al-Jihad in Palestine. There are elections in Egypt. The whole region is boiling, and Syria seems to be the last piece of the puzzle. And Assad knows, without the support of the Arab League, if he loses the support of the Arab League, then he's completely alone. So I think he should be aware, and I hope that he's aware, that this is his last chance to end this crisis with I mean, there's been so much violence already and so much blood spilled, so I hope it doesn't continue any longer.
Alexander, you were just in Syria yourself recently. Do you think that the Syrian government is now going to say, okay, well, we should honor this agreement after all? We will pull out our troops from the cities. We will release political prisoners. We will talk to the opposition, as we've agreed to now with the Arab League. Do you think that that Assad might turn around and actually honor this agreement?
Well, I don't think so, and I agree with my colleagues here that this, well, is his last chance, but at the same time, he has to cling to power. He has no alternative, and I think he will really go on and really try to quell the rebellion right now. I mean, in those 2 weeks. And then when they're done with, he will try to maybe talk with the opposition abroad. But, I mean, he will try really to strike very hard on the opposition right now. And, I mean, we can see an escalation. I mean, the numbers of dead people are really on the rise very steeply. The numbers of wounded, the numbers of arrested. So the tension is rising, and I think he knows this is his last straw, and he's going to make it very hard and very right.
Well, let's look right now into the heart of the opposition movement. Alexander Brula, you are one of the few foreign correspondents to have actually gotten inside of the country, and you were able to report there. You went there under the guise of a businessman, someone pretending to be doing business. Now, you took many risks, not only speaking to the opposition members, but you actually went out into the streets, participated in street protests yourself. We have a clip here that will show you, our audience, just what Alexander was up to there.
October 7th, somewhere in the Syrian city of Douma, Alexander Bühler, wearing a baseball cap and a scarf, is participating in a protest march. Hundreds of people are shouting anti-regime slogans. Barricades are burning in the background. The smoke is intended to block the view of the snipers. One of the demonstrators tells Bühler that he and the others are no longer afraid of anything. If we're killed, he says, then so be it. We want a better life for our children. They vow to demonstrate until either the regime has killed every one of them or the regime itself disappears. The video ends as gunshots ring out. 3 demonstrators die. 30 are wounded.
Now, there's a very dramatic situations, obviously, there, and it would be interesting to talk about your experiences in general as a reporter, but we want to focus on the opposition movement itself. You were able to get in and talk to these people individually. What did they tell you? Why? What is their motivation? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, what they see is that they have been experiencing now for the past 40 years an oppression that has been, it was so, I mean, the main difficulty really was to find out how this oppression really looked, because it was so into their minds that they couldn't even speak, almost couldn't speak about it. One of the opposition members told me that she didn't know what freedom actually was 6 months. So she said it was like being in a cave where you don't see the light. And freedom is for her now the right to be out in the street, demonstrate against the president. It's a totally new feeling, and she said she finally feels like she would own this country too, like she would own the street. It's a completely new feeling, and that is, I think, that is their motivation, that they have been estranged from their own country, that they've been oppressed, and that they see no future with this current regime.
Do you sense that the opposition movement is gaining critical mass, that they have a common cause and that they are able to unite, and that they possibly might be able to force their wishes through upon the regime?
That's very difficult to say. What I've seen is that many people are in the opposition. They take part in demonstrations, and I think it could go both ways. Now, if Assad decides to kill more and more demonstrators, more and more people might say, okay, now it's getting too much, and we will also demonstrate, or the people will say, we're going to stay at home. It's very difficult to say. I think the opposition movement is gaining more structure, they're figuring out new ways how to group themselves. But
how do they communicate? I mean, we've seen in other countries, in Arab Spring countries, in Tunisia or Libya, particularly in Egypt, that the demonstrators were able to communicate with each other, either using telephones, mobile telephones, or tweeting on the internet. So using social media. Are they wired in Syria at all? Is this an option for them?
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, they have cell phones all the time. I mean, you just have to change the thing, the SIM card. Yeah. The thing is, you have to put your fingerprint in when you buy a SIM card. So, but there are ways around it. They use proxies around the Syrian monitoring system.
Through the internet.
Through the internet. They're very wired. When I was there in Douma, in this suburb from Damascus, we are practically all the time wired online. So
Okay.
There's a good connection.
Okay, that's very interesting. Ahmed, to what degree do you think the movement in Syria has been inspired by the Arab Spring, by what we've also seen in Tunisia and Libya and in Egypt?
I think to a large extent there has been a domino effect in the Arab world, from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya to Yemen to Bahrain to also Jordan for a little while. Even in Algeria there were some demonstrations, and definitely in Syria.
But it's ongoing in Syria. It's been going on for 7 months now. There have been a lot of deaths.
Syria is a difficult case. I think Syria is a more difficult case than even Egypt or Tunisia. Syria sits in a very complex web of alliances in the region. It's a very strategic country. The makeup of the social forces in Syria is different than in Egypt or Tunisia. The Syrian regime has a much more effective apparatus of repression than in Egypt or Tunisia. Syria is a very, very special case. And we have to keep in mind two things. We have to keep in mind that the opposition is not united, which is also different than in the case of Egypt or Tunisia, even though in Egypt and Tunisia and also in Syria, the demonstrations did not start by the Islamists, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. In Egypt and Tunisia, they quickly jumped to the foreground, and they've managed to steer things in a direction that is good for their interests. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that we will see something similar happening in Syria once the regime, perhaps Bashar will stay, but the regime as a, we will see something opposite to what happened in Egypt. So maybe Bashar himself will stay, but the regime underneath him, the Alawite elite, they will probably change. And then there will be this trend that we've seen in the region so far, where the Muslim Brotherhood, the Sunni Muslims, will at least share in some kind of a power arrangement.
I wanted to ask you about this because I know you've done a lot of research into this area. Syria has a very complex religious identity. About 3/4 of the population are Sunnis, but the government is made up mainly of Alawite Shias. Is that important for understanding the fault lines in Syria, and particularly in this conflict?
That's very complex, and the answer is yes and no. There is a Sunni revival. We are seeing a Sunni revival in the Arab world, but we should not jump to the conclusion that there is something that is particularly Sunni about what is going on. What we're seeing is an ideological reconfiguration. The same old powers are still the same. Turks are Turks, Iranians are Iranians, Syrians are Syrians. What they're doing is that they are now constructing a new hegemonic ideology that would help in mobilizing the masses in a region that is becoming more and more turbulent. Arab nationalism has been defeated a long time ago. What is happening is the culmination of a trend of turning to religious ideologies, not just in the Arab world, but we see this also in Israel, we see this in Turkey, of course we've seen this in Iran, and this trend will continue, and most probably the Sunni majority will go back into becoming the main social force in Syria. What is important is the organizational capacity of each of these groups, and it seems again in Syria the intellectuals play a major role in the opposition, and they have done that for the last 10, 15 years. But at the end of the day, if there are going to be fair elections in Syria, most probably the Muslim Brotherhood and groups affiliated to them will emerge as winners, not garnering the majority of the votes, but definitely will have a role in government.
Well, the government of Bashar al-Assad obviously is trying to stop exactly that scenario that you described. Now, Heiko, I know you've been reflecting on the international aspects of this conflict quite a bit. I want to talk about the importance of Syria's allies. Syria, the government of Bashar al-Assad, does have allies, and the most important one, many say, is Iran. What role is Iran playing in all of this?
Well, I mean, I think we should put a question around, and we should ask what role does Syria play for Iran and in the Iranian scheme of things. And for Iran to hold on to its aspirations of being like a major regional power. Iran needs Arab allies. Without an Arab ally, you are like divided from that area by this, if you want, national or ethnic rift, and you can't really play much of a role in it. I mean, you can meddle a bit in Iraq, you can meddle a bit in Bahrain, but Syria is in the heart of the Arab world. It's a majority Sunni country. As long as you have this strategic asset in your hands, then you are there, right? And the second major issue is we hear now a lot about potential attacks in Iran over the nuclear program. I'm not sure how serious we are supposed to take this, but from the perspective of the people in Tehran, in this particular moment, having allies, and I'm talking here particularly about Hezbollah in Lebanon, which depends on Syria as a strategic back, so to speak, as a conduit for weapons, etc. Having Hezbollah in Lebanon with a capacity I don't know how many tens of thousands of missiles to hit Israel, if anybody, in particular Israel, may think about attacking Iran, would make me feel better in Tehran. It would make me feel, as an Iranian, making strategic calculations, that the Israelis, and maybe others, will think twice before attacking me. So here you have the enormous importance, strategic importance of Iranian presence and of the ally Syria.
So are we looking then at an axis between Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, and Ahmadinejad in Iran becoming stronger through the Arab Spring and, by extension, the uprising in Syria?
Well, I mean, until the spring, it looked as if, until the real spring in March, let's say March, it looked as if that could happen. It looked as if Egypt, so to speak, has fallen away or is drifting away from the camp that is supporting the American, if you want, plans for the region, may actually take a more like Arab nationalist stand. So here we have successes from the perspective of that camp, of the camp, the axis that you point out between Beirut and Damascus and Iran. Now, if Syria were to fall, of course, that negates any gains, and that's why Hezbollah has taken a very clear stand. It's come out repeatedly. The Secretary General of Hezbollah has come out repeatedly and taking the not so popular position of publicly defending the regime in Damascus.
Alexander, in one of your articles, you mentioned that the Iranians were actually supporting physically on the ground the Syrian government in repressing the opposition movement. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you know about that?
Well, there are different variations of this theme. When I was in Duma, I was told that the snipers were probably, or some of the snipers were probably even Al-Quds, Iranian Al-Quds guards, or soldiers, and then
Revolutionary Guards.
The Revolutionary Guards. Then when I was when I was back in Damascus, I was told that in Homs there are rumors that the Iranians use their drones for reconnaissance. And then what I also heard from a person that had been tortured in a prison, in a Secret Service prison, was that the Iranians, that he had overheard a conversation of two guards talking about Iranian consultants for torturing. I don't know. But obviously the Iranians are there and they are trying to stabilize the regime with all what they can. So this is, and probably also arms. So this is, they are playing a role.
And President Bashar al-Assad obviously is dependent on Iran for a certain amount of support, particularly as sanctions get a bit tougher and other allies, for example, Turkey, begin to drop away. But he is sounding increasingly defiant, and that was very clear in an interview that he gave recently to Andrew Gilligan of the Sunday Telegraph. Let's listen in.
Syrian President Bashar al-Assad told a British newspaper that foreign intervention in his country would cause an earthquake that would burn the whole region. Intervention against his regime would cause another Afghanistan, he said, and asked, do you want to see another Afghanistan or tens of Afghanistans?
Alexander, is that all rhetoric, or do you think there's something to what he just said?
Well, I think that refers to the common thread that al-Assad has been uttering. I mean, he's been talking about foreign extremists, about Islamists. So that's the threat he's putting to the world.
But he described, interesting, if you go back and read that interview that he gave to the Telegraph, which was curious in itself, he described Syria as the hub in the region, that if anyone intervenes in Syria, you will have an earthquake and the entire Middle East will burn. Is Syria the hub of this region? Is it the epicenter right now in the geopolitical matrix of the Middle East?
I would say it is the epicenter, but it's not the hub for Islamic extremists, as al-Assad tries to show. The people I met...
He claims that he is actually combating Islamic extremism.
Yeah, well, I mean, as his father did back in 1981 when he bombarded the city of Hama until 10 to 30,000 people were dead. So, no, and I haven't seen any sign of Islamic extremism. I've been before to Pakistan, and that was a bit different, actually. I felt very secure as a Westerner, as a Christian in Syria. It didn't make... well, they had wonderful beer, so to speak.
Ahmed, we keep hearing about desertions from the Syrian army, that members of the Syrian army are crossing over to the opposition, that the opposition is gaining momentum in that respect. Do you think that's... do you think that is just propaganda from the opposition, or do you think this is happening? Do you think there is a groundswell of support for the opposition that could play to their favor in the coming months?
It could be happening. Last figures I've heard, I think yesterday there was the figure of 10 to 15,000 people have deserted from the Syrian army. I doubt.
Do you think these are credible figures?
I'm not sure. I don't think it's what is happening now. What is changing the equation is the attention from the international community. So far, it seems that Syrians are still not fully on board of the revolution. In Damascus, in Aleppo, the large sections of the middle classes, I think they still haven't made up their minds yet which side that they want to support.
They're dependent on the government for patronage?
Dependent on the government. We also need to remember that all these authoritarian governments in the Arab world, they have been modernizing and they've been opening up the economy, which is benefiting many people from the middle class. If the tide turns against the regime, most probably they will join and they will also turn against the regime. But until now, the jury seems to be out.
We only have a couple of minutes left. Go ahead.
I would like raise take exception here a bit. I mean, this we have been hearing that for a while, and now we have the sanctions are biting. The sanctions are crippling the Syrian economy, and so I mean, I'm wondering like when that moment will come, you know, and I think what we should realize also in this equation, and I agree, maybe half of the population is not on board, maybe 2/3 are not on board. What we should realize is people have in their minds an image which is Iraq post 2003, you know, so that was the democracy, or that was regime change through foreign intervention. And we all know what happened afterwards. The Syrians know. They have like hundreds of thousands of Iraqi refugees in their midst. So those people who went out in Tartus, like I think 2 days ago, 500,000. The regime says let's say 100,000. Marish, it's a small city, you know. Or like in the past weeks, those big pro-Assad demonstrations. I think there are a lot of people who simply fear for their daily safety, existence, life, you know, who don't like the regime, but who are not sure that they will like what will come in its place.
Heiko, I read an interesting article that you just wrote for Sada. It's a journal on Arab reform and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And in that, you wrote that the United States and Europe are, quote, entirely incapable of anything substantial to stop human rights abuses in Syria or help the country's opposition. Why?
Because if you deal with a regime like this, you know, a regime that is insistent of clinging to power at any cost, or rather that can impose the cost on its own population, then really, I mean, the only thing that you can do from the outside to achieve anything, for them to change, is to create a credible scenario of forceful intervention, and that scenario simply doesn't exist.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap things up here very quickly. Alexander, any prospect of change?
I hope so, but not in the near future.
Okay, Alexander Bühler, Heiko Wimmen, and Ahmed Badawi, thank you all for being with us this week on Quadriga. Do join us again next week, and check us out on the internet at dwworld.de.